it's your friendly neighborhood science teacher, and today we're going to be talking about living things. Now, the first thing that you need to know about living things is that in scientific terminology, we call them organisms. So if you hear me use the word organisms, all that means is living things. We know if something is a living thing because it has a set of criteria. You've probably heard the word criteria before. We use it for a lot of scientific concepts, but you also use it just in your normal classwork. Criteria just means that there's a set of requirements in order for something to be successful or to fit in a certain category. So for example, if your teacher assigns you a project, you usually have criteria for that project. You have a list of things that you have to include in order for that project to be successful and for it to achieve the goal of the project. We have a set of criteria to determine if something is a living thing. If it meets all of the criteria, then it is classified as a living thing or an organism. The first piece of criteria we have in order for something to be classified as an organism is cellular organization. Now what that means is that the cells are organized in such a way that they can accomplish tasks. If you've learned anything about the human body, you know that each organ of the body has its own specific structure in order to do a task. Those organs are broken down by cells that also have different tasks depending on what organ they're in. We're not really concerned about the fact that there's multiple tasks happening in the body, but as long as the structure has that cellular organization, it classifies it as a living thing and meets the criteria. The one exception to this rule is if an organism is unicellular, meaning that it only has one cell, in which case there's not a lot of room for it to have that structure. But organisms that are multicellular have to have cellular organization. Our next piece of criteria for something to be classified as a living thing is that it must obtain and use energy. We already talked about with our last piece of criteria that cellular organization helps living things to do different tasks, but in order for those tasks to actually happen, energy needs to go in and out of the living thing. We know that we as humans use food to get energy. Something like a plant, which is also a living thing, gets sunlight. The third piece of criteria for something to be classified as an organism is that it must respond to its surroundings. Most organisms do this through some sort of a nervous system, even if it looks very different from the human nervous system. For example, we as humans have our 5 senses. Those 5 senses help us to gain information about our surroundings. They also help keep us safe from things in our surroundings that may be dangerous. Organisms like plants don't have the same nervous system that we do, but they can still sense things like what direction sunlight is from. If you've ever watched a plant that's sitting near a window, eventually the plant will start to tilt towards the source of the sunlight, not into the room where there's no sunlight. So, responding to surroundings with some sort of nervous system. The fourth piece of criteria for something to be considered an organism is that it must grow and develop over time. Obviously, we as humans grow taller as we get older. Things like plants will grow taller, animals will grow bigger. As long as there's some sort of growth happening, it meets that criteria. And I know the one exception that someone's going to point out is, but crystals and some rock structures grow over time. Why aren't they living things? They're not living things because they don't meet the rest of our criteria. If something only meets one or doesn't even meet all 4, it doesn't qualify as a living thing. Our fifth and final piece of criteria to be classified as an organism is that things that are organisms must have the ability to reproduce and create offspring. This is also something that looks very different depending on which organism is doing the reproducing. Some of them pass along DNA in pairs, some of them pass along DNA just from one parent organism. Let's test out our criteria of living things with 2 example objects. I have my plants that clearly need some water, and I have a rock. Our first criteria was that organisms have to have cellular organization. We can clearly see that the cells in our plants are organized. They're not all over the place. It's not just a blob. Our rock, even though you could argue that it has molecular structure, doesn't actually have cells. So it already doesn't meet the first criteria because it doesn't have cells. It's made of molecules. Our second piece of criteria was that it has to obtain and use energy to do tasks. I can leave this rock sitting out in the sun as long as I want. It's not going to do anything. I could leave food out for it. It's not going to eat it. This rock is completely incapable of obtaining and using energy to do tasks. My succulents, however, gain energy from the sun and grow taller. Our third piece of criteria was that organisms have to be able to respond to their environment. Again, our rock is not going to do anything no matter what happens around it. If there's an earthquake, it's just going to sit there. If there's a hurricane, it's just going to sit there. Our rock has no nervous system to respond to its environment. However, my succulent, if it doesn't have enough water, it shrivels up. If it's not getting enough sunlight, it starts to lean towards the window. You can already see that this taller one was doing that a little bit. Even the big one in here is tilted in the direction that I had the pot facing. My plant responds to external stimuli or things happening in the environment. My rock does not. Fourth criteria was ability to grow and develop over time. This plant is a lot taller than it was when I originally bought it. All of the little succulents were barely above the dirt, almost flat, and now they're sticking up out of the pot. The rock looks exactly the same as the day that I picked it up on the beach. And lastly, organisms must have the ability to reproduce or create offspring. I already have a bunch of other little potted succulents because I took leaves off of this succulent and repotted them so that it started its own plant. Therefore, my succulent reproduced and now has offspring. Rock's not going to do that. And I know some of you are going to ask, what if we broke the rock in half? Then there's 2 pieces of rock. It's still the same rock, you just broke it in half. That does not count as meeting that criteria. So, to summarize, my plant meets all the criteria for living things, my rock does not. Now that we know what makes something a living thing, we're going to start splitting our living things into categories to learn more about how they work. Our first 2 main categories of living things are autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, our little succulent from the last example is an autotroph. It makes its own food from sunlight using photosynthesis. Autotrophs make their own food using sunlight. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are things like humans and other animals that need to eat other organisms in order to get that energy. So we eat other heterotrophs or autotrophs to get energy that is stored within that organism. Regardless of if living things are autotrophs or heterotrophs, they all need 3 things in order to survive. All organisms need water, living space, and a stable internal condition. If an organism has those 3 things, plus whatever its food source is, then it is in homeostasis, which means that everything is operating the way that it's supposed to be, and the organism is in a healthy state. So now we've got our 2 big categories of organisms, but we need to break it down even further and create more levels of classification. Because as scientists, we want to be really specific about what living things we're talking about. Because of that, we have a system called taxonomy. Taxonomy is the classification of living things. Each level of taxonomy breaks down into more and more specific things for organisms to fit into that category. We'll explain what that means in a second, but first I have a different example to show you. We're going to start with something we're all familiar with, an address. We know that an address has several very specific parts that helps get boxes, packages, and mail to the correct place. We're going to use an example to talk about this. I'm sure this is an address that most of you have seen before. This is the address for Harry Potter when he lived with his aunt and uncle before going to Hogwarts. So Harry Potter lives at number 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Each line of that address tells us something different about where an envelope would be going to. If we start at the bottom, that's our most general location. Surrey is an area of England. If we move up a line, it tells us the town to go to, so we're getting more specific. Then we get the house number and the street in that town, so we're getting more specific. And finally, we are given the name of the person that this envelope is supposed to go to. So each level of that address serves a different purpose, but it gets us to a more specific location. Taxonomy works the same way. In our address example, we only had a couple different levels in order for us to get to our final location. But as you can see, taxonomy has quite a few. So our first big category is domain. Domain tells whoever is reading the list of taxonomy if the organism is prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotic meaning single-celled, eukaryotic meaning multicellular. So kind of what we talked about earlier. Our second level, kingdom, tells the reader if it is an autotroph or a heterotroph. So those 2 big categories that we also talked about earlier in the video. Phylum gets even more specific, and it tells you about the organism's structure or genetic relations. Class is determined by the organism's level of complexity, so how organized those structures are and how many different pieces and different tasks it has to do. Order, family, and genus kind of all fit together. They really just tell you more specific details about the organism's structure, appearance, traits, things like that. And finally, the species name is the formal name or Latin name of the organism that we are talking about. So if we were going to talk about a Bengal tiger, which is a specific type of tiger, it would go like this. For its domain, we obviously know that a Bengal tiger is multicellular, so that would qualify for its domain. Its kingdom is Animalia, which means it's an animal, which means that it is a heterotroph instead of an autotroph. Its phylum is Chordata, that tells us that it has a spinal cord, so that's going back to structure. Its class is Mammalia, so it tells us that it is a mammal. Order is Carnivora, which means that it eats meat. Family is Felidae. Genus is Panthera. And finally, its species is P. tigris. Overall, the system of taxonomy is really just there to help scientists sort animals into similar categories so they can analyze similar traits. So if we looked at other organisms that were in the big cats family, we would see that some of the levels would be similar to a Bengal tiger, which allows scientists to look at their similarities when studying them. So that's our introduction to the basics of living things. To go over what we learned in this video, you learned what the criteria is for something to be classified as an organism, you learned the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs, and you learned about the taxonomy system and why it is used. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it helped you review this concept. Bye!